The power of pride. When we create embarrassing situations for ourselves, we must avoid protecting our pride by engaging in actions that we know are wrong.
This principle comes from the life of King Herod, who was indeed motivated by pride when he put John the Baptist to death. Now again, we have this story in the Gospel of Matthew. But when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, where we have the same story, really what we have is the power of lust in the life of this king. So there's a principle that grows out of this story. And the story, just reviewing that, is that King Herod threw this great banquet, hired or brought in all of his military commanders, his nobles, leading men of Galilee, and this huge banquet, drinking. It was certainly an experience that reflected the lusts of the flesh. So when King Herod, probably he was drunk, he asked his adopted daughter, her mother was Herodias, and later on the name was adopted Salome. That's not used in the Bible, but she's identified with that in history. And he wanted her to do this sensuous dance in front of him and in front of all these lustful men, really, particularly, that had come. And in his drunkenness and in his lust, he offered this daughter whatever she wanted. It was a crazy thing. And he was doing a crazy thing. And that was the opportunity for Herodias, his wife, who was an illegitimate wife because she had been married to Herod's brother Philip. And John the Baptist had confronted him with adultery. And that was part of the problem, and Herodias hated him for that. And this was her opportunity when her daughter, it was her daughter, came and said, "What should I ask King Herod?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." It's a horrible, horrible story. But when you look at this, you see another principle other than lust, which is the focus that we took from Matthew. And that principle, here you have a focus on pride. Here's the setting. Let's review it. Mark chapter 6. So Herodias held a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. That is John the Baptist. She hated him with a passion. Here was her opportunity. But she could not, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing he was a righteous and holy man. And when Herod heard him, he would be very perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. And that, in a sense, is ironic, why he liked to listen to him. Maybe it sort of soothed his conscience in sort of a crazy sort of way. But notice what happened. Although the king was deeply distressed at this request, he realized how stupid he had been, even in his drunken state. I think he probably sobered up pretty quickly. Although the king was deeply distressed because of his oaths and the guests, he did not want to refuse her. The king immediately sent for an executioner and commanded him to bring John's head, so he went and beheaded him in prison. In other words, he made this statement in front of all these other dignitaries, all of these other people. And because of his pride and because of his arrogance, he followed through. And he certainly did what he should not have done. In this case, an awful, awful deed. Pride. Now, pride is the basis of many sins. And we read that in Proverbs. Look at chapter 6. Beginning in verse 16, the Lord hates 6 things. In fact, 7 are detestable to him. What's at the top? Arrogant eyes. Pride. A lying tongue. hands that shed innocent blood. There's Herod in the most awful way of taking the life of John the Baptist. A heart that plots wicked schemes. There's Herodias. You can see the power of hatred there and pride. Feet eager to run to evil, a lying witness who gives false testimony, one who stirs up trouble among brothers. And so we have here the power of pride to affect us and to cause us to do things that we should not do. And that's the principle that I think grows out of this story here in Mark. Here's the reflection and response question. Can you think of times your pride drove you to do things you knew were wrong? How about when you remain silent? You see, silence speaks. Sometimes I think pride is at the basis of silence. We don't want to be rejected, which is very closely related, by the way, to pride. And so we can reflect on our own lives in terms of what arrogance or our pride can do. It can cause us to do things that, for example, tell lies. And, it's fascinating. I was reflecting on this, and I thought, I can't remember the first time I told a lie, but I can remember a time I told a lie when I was about 8 years old. I was at a camp. And some of the other 8-year-olds had put their faith in Jesus, and frankly, I didn't want to. I resisted that. I remember that resistance until this day. And so I lied, and I said I'd already accepted Jesus to get them off my back. Now, I was 8 years old in that particular situation. And I look back at that and I think, what in the world was I thinking? And yet, as an 8-year-old, in my environment in which I was reared and so forth, I was at work protecting myself and also fear of rejection. And as I thought about that, I thought, wow, how quickly this can begin in our lives. Just that simple kind of lie, which doesn't compare at all with the kind of lying that the Proverbs is talking about. But the principle is still true. And it comes, I think, from the life of Herod, is based in pride. When we create embarrassing situations for ourselves, we must avoid protecting our pride by engaging in actions that we know are wrong.